What's going on, everybody? Today we're doing the front and rear pads and rotors on my 2000 Nissan Silvia S15 Spec-R. Of course, I've already machined the front rotors once, so they're too thin to machine again. Also, the rear pads are just super thin, so I thought it was time to take care of this beast. It's been a minute since this thing has seen a wrench. So I'm hoping it's not too torturous with rust and whatnot, but we'll find out when we get in there. So if you're curious what the brake setup is and how you can get the parts for this car, it's a Z32 front end. So essentially it's all the same parts from your Z32 300ZX. And in the back, it's a late model S14. Basically the last couple years they made the S14 is the exact same brakes they put in the S15. I'll put some information down in the description below, like torque specs and specifically which parts I use to fit this car. That's it for now, let's jump into it. For those of you that don't know, this is my S15. It's pretty stock, there's a little AEM wideband in it, stock boost gauge in the A-pillar. Otherwise, just a pretty clean car, stock seats. Removing the pads now. I've already got the rotor out. You can see my fingers coming through here. And I've compressed the pads so that the cylinders are pushed back into the caliper here, so we have some more room when we put a new thicker rotor in or new thicker pads. To get these pads out though, I've already taken off the little steel spring clip that holds in the two ends of these cotter pins. And to slide them out, it's basically just a shuffling game. Oh, of course it's spring loaded. So you get one pin out. You can take this out after you get this out. Whoop. There we go. Another pin. Should be able to come out the top. Yeah. There we go. Inboard. Crusty. Now with the pads out, I'm gonna clean out the inner contact points of the caliper, like right here with a bit of Scotch-Brite. I have a suspicion that these two pistons are a little bit frozen. I went to go and try and compress them with the pad in the way, and they didn't want to return back into the caliper very easily. These two over here did. You can see I got them squished in nicely, but this side didn't want to budge, and that might be the source of this brake juddering issue. Essentially, if these aren't returning, it's just putting extra heat into this side of the rotor, which is causing the warpage. So I might be ordering a repair kit for these soon. Upon further inspection of cleaning up the front brake pads, I discovered that the outboard pad is thicker than the inboard. This pad here, the inboard pad, is thinner. And that kind of makes sense because if this inboard pad that's being pushed on by these two pistons here that aren't retracting fully, it's going to rub more and wear on this pad more. So I think that kind of confirms the theory that these two pistons are a little bit stuck. Whenever installing new brake rotors, always make sure to clean the braking surface with brake clean to take off any packaging oil they put on them to prevent them from rusting and shipping. We got everything back in place and it's looking pretty fresh. All the clips where they should be with the bump at the bottom of the caliper and your little steel spring holding in your pins. I cleaned up these steel springs a bit so they're not so rusty, so they can shuffle back and forth a bit if they need to. Other than that, I've put in the original pads, even though I ordered a new set because they've got a lot of life in them and they're not cheap. So I'm gonna keep running them until I resolve this seized piston problem to hopefully not burn up a brand new set of pads. Last thing to torque is these caliper to knuckle large 19mm bolts. I believe the torque spec is between 85 and 90 foot-pounds. So I started working on the right side of the car now, and I've discovered that the same thing, the inner caliper pistons are a little bit stiff. This one's less stiff, I was able to get it to move, but this lower one here, it's practically frozen, it hardly moves. And also, I'll give you 3 seconds to figure out what's not right in this picture. It's this brake clip. It's supposed to be bump at the bottom here. So we'll just flip that around when we reinstall the new rotor. Onto the rear now. Now onto the rear, they're a little bit more of a pain because you have the e-brake involved, but fortunately it's not inside the rotor. You're gonna need a 14 and a 17 to get the caliper and the bracket off. The other tool I'd recommend is like a multi-purpose rear brake caliper winding tool. It's essentially a cube with a bunch of different pointy sides on it that'll get into the piston of the rear caliper and wind it back in. It's essentially the e-brake mechanism so that it always stays self-adjusted when you pull the e-brake. You need something to get into the pins and wind it back. You can also use a set of long needle nose pliers because that'll work just the same. But to get started, we're gonna bust our 14s off the top here, take the caliper out of the way, get the bracket out of the way, and the caliper is pretty much held in place by the e-brake mechanism and the hose on the left here, but always best to string up your caliper to something like a coat hanger or some zip ties to something so it's not hanging on the brake line. Let's get into it. Now the next step is to get the rotor off, but to get the rotor off, it can be quite a pain because it can be quite seized around the cup here. So the best tip I have is to use a bolt that fits in here and here and wind it in gently until you feel some pressure, and then give it maybe a quarter turn and then switch sides and go to this other hole. The bolt you need, I believe, is an M8 by 1.25. It's a pretty standard Honda bolt. Thread it in here, and once you feel it start to crack back, move on to the other side because you don't want to tilt one side too far and have it bind on the studs. So get a little room here, and just slowly work it off. If you're really belligerent and don't care, you can take a hammer to the back of the rotor, and that sometimes frees it up, but the bolt trick often works better for me. Now with the rear bracket out, we're going to essentially take out these little slider pins here. They're just held in by the rubber grommet. Take them off, slip them out. We're gonna clean this up now, get rid of the old grease and freshen it up with some new grease. What you wanna be using is silicone brake lubricant. Nice and clean. We'll also take off the little grommet. Shove some paper towel in there to get rid of the old grease because we're gonna put in some fresh stuff. Now to reassemble, essentially clean slide. Don't want any dirt on this because if you have any dirt on your slide pins, that'll get rubbed back and forth against the inner bushing that's inside the caliper bracket and wear it out quicker, so make sure it's clean. Just work it in and out a couple times, get the grease in there. Slide this back in, and then you just put the sleeve up around the collar of the slide pin. And that's that. Now we're just gonna do the next one, and then we'll throw this in the car. Now, this is the most challenging part of doing any rear brake job. You have to reset this piston back further into its housing so that you can get 2 fresh brake pads in there. So you need more room inside the housing here, so you have to get this to go back. And normally, if this was a front brake setup, you just put a C-clamp on it and squish that sucker in, but you can't, because there's an e-brake like spiral thread thing going on in here, so we have to actually turn this in. You can see these notches in the piston here. And normally you'd use, like I said, a brake tool that I'll put on the screen here. But if you're cheap like me or you just don't have one and you're a pinch, you can use some long needle nose pliers like this. Sticking the tips into the openings here will get the job done. And you need to turn it clockwise to the right to wind it in. And then the other thing to look out for is the boot. You don't want to tear the boot. You can see here the boot's kind of bound up, twisted, and not happy. I've sprayed some lubricant around here to try and separate its attachment from the piston here, because if you keep turning this and turning the boot at the same time, you'll eventually tear the boot, and that's no good. So you really got to free it up here while you're working it back and forth before you can wind it all the way in for good. After struggling with this side for a hot minute to get it to turn without twisting up the boot, I got in there with a little pick here and just got under the seal to spray some lubricant underneath it, like that layer, so I could spray some lubricant and hopefully separate it. This brake boot here looks worse for wear. I think it was left twisted because it's got a bunch of kinks and wrinkles in it, so I'm gonna just clean it off, try and wind it in as smooth as I can. Of course, it's never easy when the camera's on. One other thing you have to make note of is that these notches have to be finished horizontal. So essentially you can't just leave it like it is right now. You have to turn it until one of the notches is pointing towards the dead center of the axle. This is because on the back of the brake pads it has a notch like this, and that notch has to index with the caliper piston. Now with all the clean and fresh brakes installed, I'm just gonna bleed the brakes on the car to give it some fresh fluid because I bought some fresh .4 for the car, and hopefully it brakes better than it ever has. It's looking pretty sick. Whoa. Well, that's the wrap on the full brake job on this 2000 Nissan Silvia Spec-R. As with any new brake components, you want to bed them in. Check with your parts manufacturer that supplied your brakes, but for mine, they basically recommend doing about 10 stops from 50 kilometers an hour down to about 5 at a moderate brake pressure. This is like what's called burnishing the brake pad, and it freshens the surface to make it smooth so that the pad and the new rotor can bed in together evenly. Funny things can happen if you immediately go out and do hard highway stopping on fresh pads and rotors. You might not get the best life out of your pad, or they might squeal and chatter, just get kind of weird things. So take it easy in the bedding in process. Do as your pads and rotor companies recommend. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please smash the like and subscribe button down below and drop a comment if you want to see more S15 stuff. But as always, thanks for watching and have a good day.